What if I told you that Russia has already lost this war, not on the battlefield, but on a spreadsheet? The numbers Putin is desperately trying to hide from his own people tell a story that ends only one way. And it's not the ending the Kremlin ever planned for. Welcome back to War News. There's a conversation happening right now in military think tanks, European intelligence circles, and the halls of the Pentagon, and it's one that almost never makes it to your news feed. It's not just about who's winning or losing on the front lines of Ukraine. It goes much deeper than that. What analysts are quietly discussing is this: Russia, as a functioning military power, may have already passed its point of no return.
Now, I know that sounds like a strong statement, and I want to be clear, Russia still has nuclear weapons, it still has territory, and it still has a government that isn't going anywhere tomorrow morning. But when you actually sit down and look at the data, the real data, not the Kremlin-approved version, a picture emerges that is genuinely difficult to unsee. Today, we're going to walk through that picture piece by piece, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll be looking at this war very differently. Let's start with the bleeding. Here's a number that should stop you cold. Russia is currently losing, by most credible estimates, somewhere between 900 and 1,200 soldiers every single day.
Not wounded, not captured, dead or effectively removed from the battlefield permanently. Let that sit for a second. In a single month, that's between 27,000 and 36,000 men. In a year, we're talking about somewhere in the range of 330,000 to 430,000 soldiers wiped off the Russian military's roster. And these aren't just statistics on a page. These are real documented losses confirmed through satellite imagery, drone footage, prisoner of war testimonies, and independent battlefield tracking organizations that have been monitoring this war from day one. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds bad, but Russia is a big country with a big army. Can't they just keep recruiting? That's exactly the right question to ask. And the answer is, what makes this situation so critical? Russia entered this war with what it believed was an overwhelming advantage in manpower. In the early months of the invasion, military planners in Moscow genuinely expected that sheer numbers would eventually grind Ukraine down. And for a while, that logic seemed to hold. Russia could absorb losses that would have broken most other armies. Fresh troops kept coming, the front lines kept moving, slowly but surely in Russia's favor. But here's what changed. The math started working against Moscow. Russia set a recruitment target last year of over 420,000 new soldiers. According to official statements out of Moscow, they hit that target. In fact, they claim to have barely exceeded it. But look closer and the story falls apart.
Military analysts who study Russian force generation say the quality of troops being sent to the front line has collapsed dramatically compared to even 12 months ago. The experienced volunteers, the men who signed up willingly, who had prior military training, who understood what they were walking into, those men are largely gone. They were used up in the earlier phases of the war. What's replacing them is something else entirely. Russia has now tapped virtually every conventional recruitment source available to it. They've gone to the prisons. By the start of this year, an estimated 180,000 soldiers recruited into Russian units came directly from the penal system. Convicted criminals offered commuted sentences in exchange for service in Ukraine. And that number is almost certainly higher now. They've gone to socially vulnerable populations, the chronically unemployed, people crushed under debt, individuals dealing with addiction, men who had no other options and took the military paycheck out of desperation rather than any sense of duty or conviction. They've pressured conscripts at the end of mandatory service to sign combat contracts.
Using tactics that Estonian and Lithuanian intelligence services have both publicly described as ranging from psychological manipulation to outright coercion. And they've gone abroad. Documented analysis of Russian battlefield casualties has confirmed the presence of foreign fighters from multiple countries, men recruited internationally because the domestic supply is running thin. Think about what that tells you. This is not the behavior of a military machine that is flush with resources and on track for victory. This is the behavior of a military machine that is running on fumes and knows it. And it's getting worse by the week. Here's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in Western media. Russia is not just running out of men, it's running out of time to prepare the men. It does have, before this war, Russian military doctrine called for several months of training before a conscript was considered remotely combat ready. That standard has been completely abandoned. First-hand accounts from Russian recruits, including testimonies that have made their way out through journalists and independent Russian language media, describe a training pipeline that has collapsed to almost nothing. We're talking about 5 to 10 days of basic preparation, sometimes less, before these men are pushed toward the front lines.
To put that in perspective, the United States Marine Corps puts its recruits through 13 weeks of basic training before they're considered Marines. Russia is sending men into one of the most intense drone warfare environments in modern history after barely a week of preparation. The results are exactly what you'd expect. These undertrained, undermotivated, poorly equipped soldiers arrive at the front line and they die. Quickly, in large numbers, captured drone footage from the battlefield has documented scenes that Ukrainian commanders themselves have described as almost surreal, waves of Russian infantry advancing without basic tactical coordination, without air support, without armored cover, directly into kill zones that Ukraine's military has carefully prepared. It's not warfare in any traditional sense, it's a human conveyor belt leading toward a cliff. And all of those deaths feed back into the recruiting crisis, which feeds back into the training crisis, which feeds back into more deaths. It is a spiral that has no natural bottom unless Russia makes a fundamental change in its approach.
And right now, there is no serious sign that it will. Now, here's where the story shifts, and this is the part I really want you to focus on, because the military situation, as bad as it is actually the most visible part of Russia's problem. Underneath it, there is an economic and demographic time bomb that has been ticking for decades, and the Ukraine war has dramatically accelerated the fuse. Russia's economy is, by official numbers, holding up. The Kremlin points to GDP growth figures, to low unemployment, to the fact that the ruble hasn't collapsed entirely, and on the surface, some of those claims have a grain of truth. But here's what's underneath. Russia's economy has essentially become a wartime industrial economy, meaning the only sector that is genuinely growing is defense manufacturing. Everything else is being squeezed. Consumer goods, technology, infrastructure development, housing, all of it is being starved of investment and labor so that Russia can keep feeding the war machine. Factories across Russia are now operating below full capacity, not because of sanctions alone, though those are certainly biting, but because there aren't enough workers. The men who would be running those production lines are either in Ukraine, in a body bag somewhere in the Donbass, or they've fled the country.
That last point deserves its own spotlight. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has experienced one of the most significant brain drain events in its modern history. Hundreds of thousands of educated, skilled young Russians, engineers, programmers, doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs, have left. Many went to Georgia, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Armenia, and from there to Western Europe or further. Conservative estimates put the number of Russians who have emigrated since February 2022 at somewhere between 500,000 and 900,000. Some projections go higher. These are not just people, these are the economic engine of the next generation. These are the people who would have built companies, developed technology, trained the next cohort of workers, paid into the pension system. And they are gone. The combination of battlefield deaths and voluntary emigration has hollowed out a demographic cohort, specifically men and women in their 20s and 30s, in a way that Russia will be measuring and managing for decades to come. Let's zoom out even further. Russia's population problem didn't start with Ukraine. It's been building since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
In 1990, Russia had a population of approximately 148 million people. Today, that number is lower, and that's accounting for the populations of territories that Russia has forcibly annexed. The birth rate has been on a long, slow decline. The death rate from non-combat causes, alcohol-related illness, cardiovascular disease, poor healthcare infrastructure in rural areas remains one of the highest among developed nations. Putin has known about this problem his entire presidency. He has made public speeches about it going back to 2005. He has launched initiative after initiative to try to boost the birth rate. None of them have worked in any meaningful long-term way. And now, on top of this already fragile demographic foundation, he has added a war that has killed more than 1 million of his own soldiers, the vast majority of whom were working-age men. Let that number sink in. Over 1 million Russian soldiers killed, wounded, captured or missing since this war began.
The United Nations projects that Russia's population could fall to between 74 million and 112 million people by the year 2100. That's from roughly 146 million today. Even at the optimistic end of that projection, Russia loses a quarter of its population over the next 75 years. And at the pessimistic end, Russia ends the century with half the people it has now. What does that mean practically? It means Russia ends the century with an economy too small to maintain its current military, It means infrastructure that cannot be maintained, borders that cannot be defended at the current scale, and a geopolitical footprint that will inevitably shrink whether the Kremlin wants it to or not. This is not a fringe analysis. This is the UN, the Carnegie Endowment, and multiple independent demographic research institutes all pointing to the same destination. Putin started a war to expand Russia's territory and legacy. The war he started may instead define the beginning of Russia's long diminishment as a world power.
Let's bring this back to the battlefield, because understanding the big picture matters, but so does understanding what's happening today. Russia's offensive operations in Ukraine have not stopped. They continue to grind forward in the Donbass region, making incremental gains at enormous cost. The pace of advance, according to independent monitoring projects tracking the front lines in near real time, remains extremely slow by any military standard. At the current rate of territorial gain, multiple analysts have concluded that it would take Russia at least 2 additional years, and likely more, to fully occupy the specific regions it claims as its primary objectives. 2 more years of losses at the current rate, 2 more years of the recruitment death spiral, 2 more years of economic bleeding. Ukraine, for its part, has adapted. Its military has become arguably the most experienced drone warfare force on the planet. It has developed and deployed first-person view drones, loitering munitions, long-range strike capability, and electronic warfare systems that have fundamentally changed the calculus of the ground battle.
Russia's heavy mechanized forces, the tanks and armored vehicles that were supposed to roll through Ukraine in 72 hours back in February 2022, are largely gone. Russia has lost more armored vehicles in this war than most countries own in their entire military inventory. What Russia is using now, increasingly, is dismounted infantry. Foot soldiers, often poorly trained, pushing across open terrain toward Ukrainian defensive positions. That is not the posture of an army on the verge of a decisive breakthrough. That is the posture of an army fighting a war of pure attrition, hoping that the other side gives up first. And the other side has not given up. So where does this all end? That's the question military analysts, foreign policy experts, and intelligence agencies across the Western world are all trying to answer right now. And the honest answer is that nobody knows with certainty. What we can say with confidence is this: every additional month this war continues costs Russia something it cannot get back. Every soldier who dies is a man who won't father children. Every engineer who emigrates is a mind Russia won't recover. Every ruble spent on artillery shells is a ruble not spent on hospitals, schools, or infrastructure.